Good day, everyone. Welcome to Education 501 with the course description Philosophical and Sociological Foundations of Education. This video lecture is intended for my students at the Graduate School of Eastern Visayas State University who are taking Master of Arts in Education. And please take note that since most of my students are not graduates of philosophy and so they do not have a strong background in philosophy. I tried to be as elementary as possible in my presentation so that I could bring philosophy closer to the lives, to the experience, given that again they don't have the strong background in philosophy. So my approach or this video lecture is for beginners in philosophy. And so let me proceed to the discussion proper. Again, the topic is about the meaning of philosophy, the definition of philosophy. And for the table of contents, I'll be discussing two major topics under the topic on the definition of philosophy. The first one is on the etymological definition of philosophy. And under this, there are three subtopics. The first one is philosophy according to the ancient Greek thinkers. Second subtopic is philosophy according to the ancient Chinese thinkers or philosophers. And third is philosophy according to the ancient Indian thinkers. So I will be presenting with you the definition, the etymological definition of philosophy according to these three ancient traditions. And after presenting the etymological definition of philosophy, I will also discuss the real or formal definition of philosophy. Okay, so that's the two major topics that I'll be dealing in this video lecture. Again, the first one is etymological definition of philosophy, and the second one is the real or formal definition of philosophy. So let me proceed with right away with the um, ancient Greek conception of philosophy, or the first topic, philosophy according to the ancient Greek thinkers. So, for the ancient Greek thinkers, philosophy begins, or philosophy comes from the two Greek words philia, which means love, and sophia, which means wisdom. So, um, so literally, therefore, for the ancient Greek philosophers, philosophy is understood as the love of wisdom. But and so if philosophy is a love of wisdom, we might ask, or you may ask the question, well, what is love in this case? Or how do the ancient Greek thinkers understand love and wisdom? So we have to clarify this point because um, uh, we were or people were normally trained or we were taught to believe that every time we talk about love, we always refer to that romantic love, and sometimes erotic love. But we need to clarify our understanding of love in this case from the vantage point of the ancient Greek tradition, because for them, they understood love in a neutral, broad manner. So that for the ancient Greek thinkers, love in this case is not necessarily erotic or romantic love, but simply understood as an urge towards an object. When we say urge, we know exactly what an urge is. It's not sexual urge, but when we say urge, this is strong desire, you know, towards something, an object, for example. And so in this case, when we say you love something or we love someone, this means for the ancient Greek or in the context of this discussion, um, it means we have a strong desire towards that something or towards that someone. Okay, it's likened to a like, for example. So that if for example, when I say, I love that shoes, or I love that food, or I love that bag, that means I have a strong desire. I have an urge towards that bag, towards that object. And in this case, since love is understood as an urge towards a particular object, this urge longs for owning that object. So that is why when we love something, or when we like or love something or someone, we want to possess that someone and or something. And so if we love shoes, for example, or a bag, for example, we want to buy that bag because we want to possess that bag, possess that object. That's how the ancient Greek understood love, a strong desire for that particular object. Wisdom, on the other hand, is understood as the correct application of knowledge. So it's not just, wisdom is not just having knowledge, but about something, about what is the right thing to do and how to do it. But but the ancient Greek thinkers emphasized the idea of correct application of that knowledge. So we have the idea, for example, of a definition of knowledge as knowledge is an idea gained through experience. So once we have an idea of something, then we have knowledge of that something. Like, for example, cheating. So if we know that that cheating is wrong, and so we have a knowledge of that act as wrong, cheating as wrong, but that remains knowledge until we apply it. And so if we know that cheating is wrong and we don't cheat because we're convinced that it is not right to cheat, then we may be called a man of wisdom. So that's an act of wisdom. We apply knowledge correctly. Okay. On the other hand, we know that knowledge is we know that cheating is wrong. And even if, for example, we know that cheating is wrong and yet we keep cheating, then that is not a correct, application of knowledge. We do not apply the knowledge that cheating is wrong correctly. So if you know that cheating is wrong and yet you keep cheating, then you cannot be called a man of wisdom. We cannot call that act an act of wisdom, but a vicious act, an evil one. It is an incorrect application of knowledge. And so, and so and so philosophy as love of wisdom, as understood by the Greek, is um, is actually, insinuating or giving us the idea that for the ancient Greek philosophers, philosophy is all about acquiring knowledge, and applying it correctly. And that is why there's no wonder why most of the ancient Greek thinkers are wise men, are were men of wisdom. For example, we have um, um, Socrates, for example, we have Plato, Aristotle, we have Pythagoras and Democritus. So just example of wise men in ancient Greek philosophers, ancient Greek philosophy or ancient Greek society. These people were concerned about the acquisition of knowledge and applying that knowledge correctly. So that's how the ancient Greek thinkers understood philosophy as philia and sophia. It's the love of wisdom. Now, let me proceed to before going to the characteristic of philosophy, please take note that for the ancient Greek thinkers, philosophy was a profound and lifelong pursuit of truth, virtue, and understanding about the world and human existence. That is why in my next video lecture on the branches of philosophy, I will discuss there. I will also discuss there how philosophy differs from other disciplines like engineering or computer studies or culinary arts, because these disciplines deals with the acquisition of knowledge, technical knowledge on how, for example, to create machines and apply that knowledge in the creation of that machine. So In these disciplines, in sciences and in engineering, for example, there is an actual outputs of the particular knowledge because they are obliged, I should say, they are supposed to produce, objects out of the technical skills or their knowledge. But in the case of philosophy, our concern is all about most of the time, as I will be discussing in a while, um, questions about the origin of the world, about the meaning of life. It's all about the nature of human existence, the nature of the world. We question these things. So that's a a one of the major characteristics of philosophy. So again, for the ancient Greek thinkers, philosophy was a profound and lifelong pursuit of truth, of virtue, and understanding about the world and human existence. And so it was not just an intellectual exercise, but a way of life aimed at achieving wisdom, ethical excellence, and the good life. Now, eudaimonia, as Aristotle would call it. So um, these concepts, achieving wisdom, ethical excellence, and the good life are seldom discussed in the sciences and in engineering or in other disciplines that do not talk about the nature of the world and existence. Okay, so this is one of the businesses of philosophy. We talk about the meaning of life. We question about the origin of the world, and so it's an intellectual exercise at the same time, of course, but aim at you know achieving wisdom and being virtuous, a man of virtue, through the study and the application of ethics, and of course, the good life. Now, let me proceed to the key features of ancient Greek philosophy, just very briefly. Although I can proceed to the next one, but I think it helps if I briefly discuss to you um, the key features of ancient Greek philosophy. The first one states that philosophy is the search for truth and knowledge. So, and that is why it is the primary business of philosophy is to question everything, to question reality. You know, why did, for example, in theodicy, we ask the question, why did God allow evil in the world? Or in epistemology, we ask about the validity of knowledge and truth. So philosophy deals with that, and this is one of the key features of ancient Greek philosophy. So ancient Greek philosophers believed that human reason could uncover the truth of the universe. We have to remember, as I will discuss in the other video lectures on the origin of philosophy, the ancient Greek thinkers thought about, they they're curious about the workings of the universe. They want to answer, for example, the origin of the world, you know, and they wish to question about the material upon which the world is formed. And then when they experience difficulties and challenges, sadness and all stuff for that matter, they ask the question about the meaning of life. And we even ask the question, why, if there is a God, then we ask the question, why did God create me as an immortal being? What's the point of living? What's the point of suffering? Where at the end of the day, we will all die. So these are, you know, some of the important concepts that, philosophy tried to answer, and the truth and knowledge, of course. Hence, the ancient Greek thinkers or philosophers sought to understand the origin and nature of the cosmos, and when we go to the discussion on the branches of philosophy in my next video lecture that fall the question about the origin and nature of the cosmos of the universe falls under cosmology and metaphysics. They also sought to understand the nature of the human soul and human existence, psychology in a sense, from the Greek word psyche and logos, the study of the mind and how people behave. I will discuss also or I will clarify this also in my discussion on the major branches of philosophy, that psychology, we use the word psychology here, but it's not exactly the same with the understanding of psychology as we understand today now, as a discipline. So psychology in this case is viewed in the context of the ancient Greek tradition. Psychology is simply, or not simply, is akin to saying philosophy of the human person or philosophical anthropology. And then thirdly, the ancient Greek philosophers also sought to understand the limits and scope of knowledge. Okay, this is very one of the major branches of philosophy, epistemology. So we would be dealing with this, or I will discuss this further when I go to when I discuss the four major branches of philosophy. Okay. And then second, philosophy as ethical and practical wisdom, a second key feature of ancient Greek philosophy. In fact, for many Greeks, especially Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, philosophy was primarily about how to live well, with reason, virtue, and justice. And as I will discuss in, say, in the next video lecture in the major branches of philosophy, we'll discuss ethics there. Now, it's one of the major branches of philosophy. Ethics, which deals with the morality of a human act or the rightness or wrongness of a human act. So we have this. So philosophy also deals with ethics and practical wisdom aimed at, knowing how to live well. And then later on in existential philosophy, this is related to the idea of finding meaning in life, finding meaning in a seemingly meaningless world, in a seemingly meaningless life, in a brutal, rubbish world. In the case of Socrates, for example, Socrates thought that the unexamined life is not worth living. And so Socrates saw philosophy as a moral practice to question one's own beliefs and live a virtuous life. So, as I will explain later on, the primary business of philosophy is thinking. And in this case, thinking or questioning is thinking. And in the case of Socrates, it's not enough to know things. It's not enough to know reality, but we got to question our own beliefs, our own way of thinking, because in relation to the first key feature, we are after of the truth. Okay, so it's not enough to know for Socrates, but we also need to know why we know and why we behave that way and why we need to act that way. But again, in the case of Socrates, philosophy is geared towards the attainments of, a virtuous life, an ethical life. In the case of Plato, Plato viewed philosophy as a path to discovering eternal truths and the forms or ideal realities. I don't have time to discuss this very important concept in Platonic philosophy, the idea of the forms. My intention or my primary concern in this video lecture is to introduce to you the definition of philosophy. So I'll set aside the discussion on Plato's conception of the forms. And then in the case of Aristotle, Aristotle defined philosophy as the search for causes and principles, but especially emphasized practical wisdom or pronosis and the cultivation of virtue. So if when we go to the formal definition of philosophy, we talk about philosophy as, a study of beings and their ultimate causes, reasons, and principles through the aid of human reason alone. So that conception, that formal or real definition of philosophy is very much influenced by, informed by Aristotle, because Aristotle again tried to question or search for the origin of the worlds, the ultimate cause or principle of everything that exists. Okay. But again, I have to emphasize this one. We have to emphasize that Aristotle also um, um, Aristotle's philosophy also aims for the attainment of the good life, eudaimonia, which can be done by, the practice of virtue, by constantly, doing good. And then third, philosophy as wonder and curiosity. As I will discuss in the next video lecture on the origin of philosophy, just to preempt the discussion on that, in terms of thinking, philosophy begins in wonder. Um, um, and that is why for the ancient Greek philosophers, philosophy, is attributed to is concerned about wonder and curiosity. And but we have to take note in this case that um, wonder and being curious is not the same with the normal tendency of humans to know trivial things, like in the case of gossips or chismes in the Filipino context. We are so curious about when there is, for example, uh, a commotion in our neighbor. We want to know what's happening with our nasty neighbor, or when there's an accident, a road accidents, people gather together and look at what happened, observe what happened, witness what happened. But please take note that might be understood as curiosity. Um, um, in the strict sense of the words. But when we say wonder and curiosity in philosophy, it's a loaded concept. Um, in fact, for Plato and Aristotle, both of them said that philosophy begins in wonder, okay, or Tauma sein. And then Aristotle said, all men by nature desire to know. Yeah. And then he said he believed that philosophy starts with awe and leads to understanding of causes and first principles. So going back again to the idea of curiosity and wonder in philosophy, these are loaded terms. It's not just being curious about what happened to my colleague out there in the other my colleague in the other cubicle, or what happened to the person who met a road accident. That might be curiosity, but again, wonder and curiosity in philosophy is being curious about, in the face of awe, in the face of amazement, astonishment about, let's say, the mysteriousness of the universe, about the nature of life. Let's say, for example, again, in the case of cosmology, from the very beginning, people wonder about the origin of the world. The universe is so mysterious. People think, if you think, for example, the universe is boundless. And if it's boundless, where does it end? It has no end, of course. It's limitless, it's boundless. So i- we can really conceive or picture the entire universe. That's how mysterious the universe is. So that's a concrete example. So when we are amazed, astonished by the reality of the mysteriousness of the universe, for example, that's a concrete example of wonder and curiosity in philosophy. And this wonder and curiosity leads to questioning that reality for the sake of understanding that reality. That's what Aristotle meant by men by nature desire to know. We want to know, we want to investigate, we want to question these things, these realities. And so again, please do not equate curiosity in this case, wonder and curiosity in this case, with gossips and chismes and other trivial, things. Okay, so much for uh, the ancient Greek philosophers. Let me proceed to the subtopic on philosophy according to the ancient Chinese philosophers. And please take note that again, we're still under the first major topic of this video lecture on the etymological definition of philosophy. Now, if the ancient Greek philosophers have Philia and Sophia, the the ancient Chinese philosophers have Qi Sui, or philosophy in the Chinese tradition is referred to as Qi Sui. I'm not Chinese, forgive me if I don't pronounce the words correctly. But let me just say Qi Sui. And then Qi in this case means wisdom or sage, and Sui means learning or study. So similar to the love of wisdom of the ancient Greek philosophers, Philia and Sophia, philosophy for the Chinese, for the ancient Chinese thinkers, is a study of wisdom. Okay, so Qi Sui literally translates to the study of wisdom. Similar again to the love of wisdom, the Philia and Sophia of the ancient Greek thinkers. And I don't need to explain further what study and wisdom is, it's quite obvious. But I wish to emphasize that just like the ancient Greek philosophers, whose concern is the acquisition of knowledge, and its correct application, because they want to become more man of wisdom. They want to become wise men. In the case of Chinese philosophy, still, they want to study wisdom because the aim, especially for example, in the case of Confucius, is Chunzi, or the realization of the gentleman, of the ideal person. And so in ancient Chinese philosophy, the goal is, one of the goals, of course, is to attain, is the actual uh, um is the actualization of the potentialities of humans to become gentlemen, or good ethical human beings. There's no wonder again that just like in ancient Greek philosophers, most of the ancient Chinese thinkers were sages, were wise men. Confucius, for example, we have Mingzi or Mencius, we have Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi. Okay? Now let me proceed to the before I go to the characteristic of Chinese philosophy, let me just very briefly talk about the philosophy in the context of ancient China, or the Chinese context. It is important to know that in the Chinese tradition, philosophy is less about abstract reasoning, as in the case of logic and epistemology, and more about practical wisdom, ethical cultivation, and harmonious living. It is deeply connected to how a person conducts themselves, governs society, and aligns with the natural worlds, or Tao. So that's how we picture philosophy in the Chinese context, especially in the ancient Chinese context, okay, society. It's philosophy is all about, not all about, but mostly concerned about gaining practical wisdom, and developing, the self morally, so that I became an ethical person. Yeah. Key features of Chinese philosophy. I would just like to reiterate some concepts that I already have explained. The first one is practical and ethical focus. So Chinese philosophy is concerned with how to live well, how to cultivate virtue, and how to create harmony in society. So these concepts are the core concepts of Confucius philosophy. If you're familiar with Confucius philosophy, Confucius taught about how to become a gentleman, how the Zunzi, the ideal person, an ethical one. And then second is holistic and relational. Second characteristic or feature of Chinese philosophy is holistic and relational. So Chinese thought often emphasizes the interconnectedness of all things rather than the isolated individual. So there's a tendency for Western philosophy to be individualistic, to focus on concepts, scientific thinking, and the the isolation, a binary between black and whites and hard and soft and things like that. But in the case of Chinese philosophy, there is the emphasis on interconnectedness of all things in the universe. So I am, as a human being, not actually dissociated from nature, but I am part and parcel of Tao, of the entire natural world. Right? That's one of another feature of Chinese philosophy. And then the third is in relation to the second one, harmony with nature. So central in Taoist and Confucian thought is the idea of living in accordance with the Tao or the way or the natural order. So in Taoism, for example, there's always most of the time the teachings are geared towards attaining, a meaningful life. Like for example, uh, the famous idea of going with the flow, that you do not need to resist nature, that you need to the way to our harmonious life is to go with the flow, like sailing, when you sail against the strong currents, it's going to be challenging and difficult, but if you just go with the flow, you don't go against the strong currents. If you just um go with the flow with the currents, and sailing in this case is easy. You don't exert force. Life is not going to be stressful because you just align yourself with nature. And fourth is self-cultivation. Another very important key feature of Chinese philosophy. Moral developments, particularly in Confucianism, is a key goal of philosophical reflection in Chinese philosophy. So that's again, I've been reiterating that points. The moral developments, the attainments of an ethical, good life is always the primary goal of ancient Chinese philosophy, and I think until now. Okay, so much for the discussion on philosophy according to the ancient Chinese thinkers. Let me proceed now to the last subtopic under the etymological definition of philosophy. And so, if the ancient Greek philosophers of Philia and Sophia and the Chinese have Chisui, respectively, the the ancient Indian thinkers have Darsana. I don't exactly know how to pronounce Darsana. It's a Sanskrit word, but let's just say Darsana. So in ancient Indian thought, philosophy is known as Darsana, which literally means seeing or vision or insight. Unlike the Western term philosophy as love of wisdom, in the ancient Greek tradition, Darsana emphasizes a direct insight into the nature of reality, often combining spiritual practice, metaphysical inquiry, and ethical living. That is why the famous meditation in 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 Indian philosophy, because that's I'm not sure if this is the only way, but the best way to um, have a direct insight into the nature of reality, similar to Taoism, aligning yourself to reality, to, if you allow me to use the word God, to reality as a whole. Just to reiterate, the roots word ders means to see. Hence, darsana refers to a viewpoint or a vision of truth. Now, I want to emphasize this one, that what's beautiful about the idea of darsana as the idea of philosophy as darsana for the ancient Indian thinkers is that darsana or seeing is not only seeing through the eyes, but darsana is seeing through the whole person that sees, which means going beyond what the eyes can see. Of course, darsana or seeing or vision or viewpoints, of course, is related to the physical eyes or a vision, but and that's part and parcel of the entire idea of seeing. But we need to remember, or please take note that darsana in this case is seeing also means in this case is going beyond what the eyes can see. And that is why the idea of, and that is why the meditation, the idea of, going beyond the material self. To understand these difficult concepts, let me use the analogy of, let's say, relating with someone in human relations. It's very common, for example, it's very common in human relations that that people tend to relate with someone who is rich and famous. Most of the time, we are selfish. Our mind is hardwired to that reality. We're so proud if our friend is rich or famous or powerful because there is this inner, although unintentional, but I think it's natural for us to be able to, has this longing to take advantage of the other's richness, of the other's power. Okay. So my point is, when we relate with someone or when we establish a relationship with someone because he is rich and famous and powerful, that is not seeing beyond what the eyes can see. In that selfish relationship, we treat the other as a tool, as an object to be manipulated. And so I just see the other person as a rich man, as a powerful man, as a famous person. So the relationship there is selfish. I relate with the image of the person only as rich, famous, and powerful. That's how we normally relate with people. Okay. That's a seeing through the naked eyes only. But Darsana again is more than that. We also go beyond what we see by the naked eyes, what by our naked eyes. And so the idea is yes, we are attracted to, we tend to establish a relationship with the rich, famous, and powerful, but Darsana is going beyond that, establishing a holistic relationship with the other. In other words, I going beyond in this case is establishing a holistic relationship with the other, and establishing a holistic relationship with the other in this case means the other is not just an object. Yes, I have to relate with him or her because he is rich and famous, but I have to relate with him or her because he is a human person that needs respect. Because the point is, in a limited foresight, in seeing, in not going beyond what we see. In this case, again, just to simplify these things, we have a tendency to get rid of the other once the other loses his or her fascination. So since we relate with the other person because he is rich and famous, but once the other, God forbid, for example, once the other loses his wealth, his power, you know, and so He is, and so we could not take advantage of the other anymore. Tendency of people, the natural tendency is to get rid of the relationship, to get rid of the person. Because again, we just relate with the image of the other as rich and famous. We don't go beyond. So the call of the ancient Indian thinkers in this case is go beyond with the image. Yes, it's normal for us to be attracted to famous and rich and beautiful and powerful people, but the ancient Indian thinkers, as I see it, are we're calling us to go beyond this mere relationship, this mere image, so that even if the other loses his or her wealth or his fascination or his power, we need to continue to respect, to establish a genuine relationship with that other, because he or she is a person that deserves respect, deserve our care, deserve our attention. Okay, so that's what we exactly mean by to see a vision going beyond, you know, the material things, the image, what we see in the other person. And Darsana offers a systematic worldview about the self, the word Atman in ancient Indian philosophy, the cosmos, sometimes understood as the world, but in this case, cosmos of the world refers to the entirety of the universe, consciousness, liberation, moksha, and ultimate reality, Brahman. For for the ancient Indian philosophers, darsana is a visionary path to truth and liberation, blending reason, experience, ethics, and spiritual practice. Okay, so much for the etymological definition of philosophy. Let me now proceed to the discussion on the real or formal definition of philosophy. So again, the first discussion is on the etymological definition of philosophy, the root for the philosophy, philia and sophia, Chiaswe, Darsana. Here, we have the real or formal definition of philosophy, and we borrow our understanding or our definition of philosophy here from Aristotle and Saint Thomas Aquinas, as the famous Catholic philosopher Paul Glenn framed it. Okay, so what is philosophy in the strict sense, in the formal sense? Philosophy, according to Aristotle, developed by St. Thomas Aquinas, as Paul Glenn framed it, is a science that studies beings in their ultimate causes, reasons, and principles through the aid of human reason alone. Okay, so um, I will very briefly discuss in the next slides that philosophy is a science for Saint Thomas Aquinas and for Aristotle, of course, and 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 this science studies being or beings. And when we say beings or being in philosophy, especially in Thomistic philosophy or in Aristotelian philosophy, we refer to anything that can be conceived by the human minds, material or immaterial. That's being for Aristotle. Okay? The table, the chair, the pen, the paper, person, tree, flowers, the laptop, the watch, anything that can be conceived by the human mind is being. The wind, things that we can think of, immaterial things, these are beings. And again, philosophy studies these beings in their ultimate causes, reasons, and principles. And so philosophy aims to investigate, study the reality of these things, the causes, for example, of the universe, the causes, for example, of of the events in nature. We try to philosophy. also tries to think of question about the reason behind, you know, my suffering, for example, the principles behind them, these things. And I want to emphasize this one through the aid of reason alone. Although many philosophers are believers, believe in God, but in the strict sense of the word, when we say philosophy, there's no room for faith. That is why in the discussion on the four major branches of philosophy and the sub-branch of philosophy, we'll be talking about theodicy or the study of gods, um, or natural theology and theology proper. So from the word theos, which means God, and logos, which means study. So theology or natural theology, case of theodicy, is that branch of philosophy that studies God through reason and faith. So there's a combination. In theodicy, we study God through, or in theology proper, we study God through reason and faith. But in philosophy, even if I am a believer, even if that philosopher is a believer of God, when we study reality, we do not resort to faith in this case. So we just use reason in understanding anything we wish to understand, in making sense of our suffering, poverty, hunger, victims of war. So when we try to question about these things, what's the reason behind the suffering of these people? Why did God allow these people to suffer? So we study this reality through the aid of reason alone. Again, we don't use faith in philosophy. For Paul Glenn, philosophy is irrational, systematic quest for ultimate truth. It seeks to understand everything that exists by uncovering its deepest causes and reasons, using human reason alone as its tool. That's from the famous um, Catholic philosopher Paul Glenn. So that's how we define philosophy in the real sense, or that's how we understand philosophy. The definition of philosophy, the real definition of philosophy, or the real formal definition of philosophy. So again, philosophy is a science, at least for Aristotle, developed by St. Thomas Aquinas, as framed by Paul Glenn. Philosophy is a science that studies being in their ultimate causes, reasons, and principles through the aid of human reason alone. And then I wish to explain very briefly before we end this lecture, Paul Glenn's definition of philosophy. First is philosophy is a science, as I mentioned a while ago. Philosophy is a science that studies being, blah, 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 blah. So it's a science. Here, science means systematic, organized knowledge, not just empirical science. So, there's a debate about between philosophers and the biologists, the chemists, the empirical, the adherents of empirical science. They argue that philosophy is not a science because they have this different conception of science. But for Paul Glenn, science in this context means a systematic, organized knowledge. Hence, philosophical enterprise is a scientific enterprise. Okay? So, philosophy is a discipline and rational pursuit of truth. Hence, the approach is scientific. And so, philosophical enterprise, again, is a scientific enterprise. Second is philosophy studies all things, beings, everything that exists, material or immaterial. Right? So, according to Paul Glenn, philosophy seeks to understand all of reality, material and immaterial, physical and metaphysical. So it does not limit itself to one domain like biology or physics. In the case of microbiology, for example, so that discipline, that scientific approach studies micro. What do we study in microbiology? Microbes, I don't know. Anyway, that discipline studies a specific phenomenon. It specializes in that particular phenomenon. While philosophy studies everything that can be conceived by the human mind. Yeah. Soul, spirit, philosophy studies the nature and dynamics of the mysteriousness of the universe, of this mysterious universe. Philosophy questions or studies my feelings, why I behave this way. Why is the feelings, for example, oscillate in the morning, you're ecstatic, in the afternoon, you're so sad, and it goes on and on and on. While while we continue to live, we continue to experience that way. There's no permanent fixed feeling about anything. It oscillates. You're sad, you're happy. That's it. Philosophy, even, also studies those things. Third, through their ultimate causes. Okay. According to Paul Glenn, philosophy investigates the deepest explanations of things, their essence, origin, purpose, and underlying principles. Again, just to reiterate, these topics, these concepts are not covered in other disciplines like engineering, like culinary arts, like information technology, computer studies, like like biology or physics. They have a specific phenomenon to investigate to study. But in the case of philosophy, you know, you talk about again the meaning of life. How do we find meaning in this brutal, rubbish world? How do we find meaning if we suffer all the time? We ask about the origin of the universe, the origin of the human species. The Bible said, Genesis said, from the very beginning there was God, and God maybe was bored. No, I'm just kidding. And then yeah, in the sixth day he created humans out of clay, and they formed the clay into humans and breathed spirit in it, and man came into the fore. Adam came into the fore, and Adam maybe got bored, got bored, and no, I'm just kidding. And then since Adam is alone, and so as the Bible said, so God got part of Adam's ribs and created that into formed that into another human person, the opposite sex, Eve. And that's how the Bible taught us the origin of the worlds. But in philosophy, we question that. Is that really, does life really human or does human species really originate from that? Is that really true? So philosophy tried to question that one. Yeah. And in terms of purpose, for example, what's the purpose of life? We, especially in the case of, yeah, if you talk about suffering, if you think about, for example, the next, we struggled for the first 40 years of our life. We study for 20 years, 20 or so, 20, 22, 24 years. We took master's degree and PhD. And then at age 40, we became relatively, financially stable. And then after 40, we're now preparing for our death at 60 or 70 or 80 or so. And everything is just a preparation for that end. The question is, what really is the purpose of life? You know? If at the end of the day, we're just preparing for our death soon, or sooner or later, what's the underlying principle of things around me? and things like that. Okay. So this reflects the influence of Aristotle's four causes, especially the final cause, purpose, and the first cause, or origin of existence. Fourth, explained by reason alone. So philosophy, according to Paul Glenn, uses natural reason and logic without relying on faith, revelation, or religious authority. That's what I meant a while ago, that when philosophy studies everything material or immaterial, it uses reason alone. There's no room for faith in philosophy. So this distinguishes it from theology, as I already mentioned a while ago, which accepts divine truths revealed by God. So in theology, from the word theos, which means God, and logos, which means study, theology is the study of God. And in this discipline, in this discipline, we study God through reason and faith. But in the case of theodicy, natural theodicy, we study God through reason alone. Okay? But again, please don't get me wrong. That doesn't mean philosophers are atheists. Of course, many philosophers are believers. It's just that when they study things, they set aside their faith. They have to exhaust the reason first, a logical way of understanding things before, at the end of the day, this sort of faith, in case faith is necessary in that instance. Okay, so much for the definition of philosophy. Thank you very much for your attention. In my next video lecture, I will discuss the four major branches of philosophy. But at this point, I hope I'm able to introduce, no matter how elementary, the definition of philosophy, at least to my Master of Arts in Education students in Eastern Visayas, in the Graduate School of Eastern Visayas State University. At least you became quite familiar with our discipline, with philosophy. As I mentioned in our orientation, I did my undergraduate AB in philosophy, Master of Arts in philosophy, PhD in philosophy, and a postdoc in philosophy. So I love philosophy, and this is our profession. And so this is just what I have discussed to you. It's just um, um, a bird's eye view of what really philosophy is. So much for now. Thank you very much for your attention, and yeah, have a good one. Bye for now.